There exists buried in the archives of a South Carolina courthouse a single page that county officials tried to burn 3 separate times. Each attempt failed under circumstances the records describe only as irregular. The document lists 47 rules that governed entry into one man's home between 1821 and 1847. Rule number 12 requires every person crossing the threshold to submerge their bare feet in a copper basin filled with what the document calls prepared water. Rule 31 demands they recite specific phrases while facing eastward. Rule 43 is redacted entirely, the ink scraped away so violently the paper tore. Local historians have spent decades trying to understand why these rituals existed, and more disturbingly, why 17 people died attempting to complete them. The man who created these rules left behind 14 journals, but authorities sealed them in 1849 after 3 researchers who read them suffered what physicians documented as severe mental disturbances. Tonight, we piece together what really happened inside that house and why those who entered it were never quite the same. Before we continue with the story of Evander Stapleton and the threshold no one could cross unchanged. If stories of forgotten American horrors fascinate you, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1 and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing these events happened somewhere in our shared past, perhaps closer to your home than you'd imagine. Now, let's discover what awaited those who approached Stapleton's door. The rituals began in a place where ritual already governed every aspect of existence. Hartwell Landing occupied 700 acres along the Edisto River, 30 miles inland from Charleston. The settlement consisted of the main house, a structure of Charleston's single-house design with piazzas facing the prevailing winds, 17 outbuildings, including a separate kitchen, smokehouse, and cooper, and 43 dwellings that housed 109 enslaved people who worked the rice fields that made Evander Stapleton one of the wealthiest men in the Carolina Low Country. Stapleton arrived in Charleston in 1819 with credentials from the University of Edinburgh, claiming expertise in what he called agricultural chemistry. He purchased Hartwell Landing from the estate of Thomas Grimbaugh, a planter whose sons had died in the War of 1812, leaving no heirs. Within months, Stapleton's rice yields exceeded anything the Grimbaugh family had achieved in 3 generations. Other planters attributed this success to his Scottish farming methods. They were wrong. The enslaved community at Hartwell Landing quickly learned that Stapleton operated according to principles unlike any they had encountered under previous ownership. He instituted what he termed systematic management, detailed records of every task, every movement, every interaction. But it was his obsession with the threshold of his home that set him apart. No one, enslaved or free, white or black, entered his house without completing what he called the necessary preparations. Among the enslaved population, a woman named Dina served as head of the main house staff. She had worked at Hartwell Landing since childhood, first under the Grimbaugh family, then under Stapleton's increasingly peculiar regime. At 41 years old, she had survived smallpox, childbirth that killed 2 of her 4 children, and the arbitrary cruelties that defined her existence. She possessed something rare in that place and time, a partially literate mind. The Grimmel children had taught her letters in exchange for stories before their mother discovered and ended the arrangement. Dinina lived in a cabin closest to the main house with her surviving children, Marcus, 17, who worked the fields, and Ruth, 14, who helped in the kitchen. Her husband, Samuel, had been sold away to a Savannah buyer in 1816, and she had not heard his name spoken aloud since. She carried this absence like a physical weight, something that pressed against her chest in quiet moments. The spring of 1818 121 arrived with unusual warmth. Stapleton summoned Dinah to the main house on a Wednesday morning, requiring her to perform the entry ritual for the first time under his new expanded rules. She had entered the house hundreds of times under the Grimball family. She thought she understood what service in a plantation house demanded. She understood nothing. The basin waited on the patsa as it always did. Copper, 18 in diameter, filled with water that carried a strange mineral smell Dinah could not identify. Stapleton stood beside it, dressed in his customary black coat, holding a leather-bound notebook. "Remove your shoes," he instructed. Dinah complied, placing her worn brooms beside the door. The April air felt cool against her bare feet. "Step into the basin, submerge your feet completely, count to 30. You must count aloud." She lowered her feet into the water. It felt warmer than she expected, and there was something else, a slight, tingling sensation that intensified as she counted. 1, 2, 3. Her voice sounded strange in the morning quiet, with only Stapleton's breathing and the distant calls of rice birds from the fields. When she reached 30, Stapleton gestured for her to step out. "Now face east. Repeat after me. I enter this house with clear purpose. I bring nothing hidden. I leave nothing concealed." The words felt heavy in her mouth, as though speaking them created some kind of obligation she could not name. Stapleton wrote something in his notebook, his pen scratching rapidly. "You may dry your feet and enter," he said, pointing to a cloth folded beside the doorway. Inside, the house felt different. Dinah could not articulate how or why, but something in the quality of the air, the way sound carried through the room, seemed altered. Stapleton followed her inside, still writing in his notebook. "Your daily tasks remain unchanged," he said, not looking up from his writing. "But understand this, the ritual is not symbolic. It serves a specific function. Those who complete it improperly face consequences." He did not elaborate on what those consequences might be. For 3 weeks, Dinah performed the ritual each morning without incident. The other house servants, Julia, who cleaned the upper floors, Benjamin, who maintained the fires and carried water, and Thomas, who served as Stapleton's personal attendant, all underwent similar procedures. They compared experiences in whispered conversations in the kitchen building, trying to understand what Stapleton sought through these strange requirements. Then on a Thursday morning in early May, something went wrong. Julia arrived at the basin that morning, showing signs of illness, a slight fever, exhaustion from caring for her own sick child. Through the night, she stepped into the basin as required, but when she began counting, she stumbled over the numbers, losing her place somewhere around 17. "Begin again," Stapleton commanded. Julia restarted, but her voice shook. She reached 30, but when she attempted to recite the required phrases, she transposed 2 words, saying, "Nothing hidden before clear purpose." Stapleton's face remained expressionless, but he made a mark in his notebook with such force that Dinah heard the pen nib tear the paper. "You may not enter today," he told Julia. "Return tomorrow." Julia stared at him, confusion evident in her face. "Sir, I've got to prepare." "Tomorrow," Stapleton repeated, and there was something in his tone that ended all discussion. Julia left. Dinah completed her own ritual and entered the house unsettled by what she had witnessed. That evening, Julia's daughter, the child who had been ill, died. The community physician, Dr. Wetherb, attributed the death to lung fever, not uncommon among children in the Carolina Low Country's humid climate. But Julia herself, when Dinah visited her in her cabin that night, kept repeating the same words. "I couldn't enter the house and she died. That's not how it works," Dinah said, though her own certainty faltered. "Your child was already sick." Dr. Wetherb said, "I couldn't enter," Julia said again and would say nothing else. The following morning, Julia completed the ritual without error and resumed her duties. But she moved through the house like someone navigating a place she no longer recognized, flinching at shadows, starting at ordinary sounds. 2 weeks later, Benjamin made his own mistake. He stepped into the basin but forgot to count aloud. Moving his lips silently through the numbers, Stapleton stopped him at once. "Aloud," he said. "The counting must be audible." Benjamin started over, but now his nervousness made him rush, reaching 30 in what seemed like 15 seconds. Stapleton's expression hardened. Each count must be distinct and separate, 1 full second between each number. You will practice this counting in the field tonight and return tomorrow, prepared to do it correctly. That night, Benjamin's wife, Hannah, found him in their cabin, counting endlessly, rocking back and forth. 1, 2, 3, 4. His eyes were open but seemed to register nothing. She shook him and he stopped, looking at her with an expression she later described to Dina as like he'd forgotten who I was for just a moment. The ritual consumed him. He practiced the counting for 6 hours that night, then all the next day while working in the rice fields, earning a reprimand from the overseer, Joseph Ketch, for distraction from his tasks. When he finally completed the ritual correctly the following morning, he had developed a slight tremor in his hands that never entirely disappeared. The enslaved community began calling the basin Stapleton's judgment, though never where any white person could hear. They discussed the ritual in careful coded language, who had stumbled, who had performed it perfectly, who seemed changed afterward. Diner watched Stapleton during this period with growing unease. He kept meticulous records of every ritual performance, noting in his journals the exact time each person arrived at the basin, any errors they made, how long it took them to complete the process. He had begun requiring the ritual not just once daily, but sometimes 2 or 3 times, particularly if someone needed to enter the house for an urgent task after having already completed their morning ritual. Most disturbing were the additions. The list of rules Stapleton had posted beside the basin grew longer. By June, there were 23 distinct requirements. By August, 37. They encompassed everything from the precise angle at which one should face while reciting the phrases to the number of breaths one should take between entering the basin and beginning the count. Marcus, Diner's son, began working as a house servant that summer after an injury to his leg made fieldwork temporarily impossible. He underwent the ritual training with intense focus, determined not to make the mistakes that had affected Julia and Benjamin. But the complexity of the requirements had grown so extensive that even Dinina herself, who had been performing the ritual longest, found herself consulting the posted rules before each entry. One evening in September, Dinina noticed that Stapleton had added a new requirement, number 39. Those who enter must do so with right foot first, stepping over the threshold in a single motion without touching the frame. Such specificity seemed purposeless, even obsessive, but Dina had learned not to question. She simply added this requirement to her mental catalog of the necessary preparations. Then came the morning that changed everything. October arrived with unseasonable cold. The field prepared for the rice harvest, and the enslaved community worked 16-hour days bringing in the crop that would determine Stapleton's profits for the year. Diner saw her children only in the brief hours after dark, when exhaustion made conversation impossible. On the morning of October 19, 1821, a new servant arrived at Hartwell Landing. His name was Aaron, purchased at the Charleston market from an estate liquidation. He came from Virginia originally, had worked in tobacco fields, knew nothing of rice cultivation or Carolina customs. The community welcomed him with the cautious generosity that defined their interactions, offering advice on how to manage the work, where to find the best water, which overseers showed relative fairness. Aaron learned quickly that Stapleton's house operated under unique rules. Other servants explained the ritual, demonstrated the counting, showed him the posted requirements. He seemed to understand, nodding seriously as they described each step. His first attempt at the ritual occurred on his 3rd morning at Hartwell Landing. Diner watched from the kitchen building as Aaron approached the basin. Stapleton stood ready with his notebook. Aaron removed his shoes, stepped into the basin, and began counting. His voice carried clearly across the space between the house and kitchen. 1, 2, 3. He reached 30 without error. He stepped out, faced east, and recited the required phrases perfectly. Then he moved toward the door, stepped over the threshold with his right foot first, and stumbled. His left foot following behind brushed against the door frame. The sound was barely audible, just the whisper of skin against wood, but Stapleton heard it. He made a mark in his notebook that Dinina could hear from where she stood. Sharp, violent slash of pen against paper. "You have failed the threshold requirement," Stapleton said, his voice flat. "You may not enter." Aaron stared at him, clearly confused. "Sir, I apologize. I can't." "Try again." The ritual permits no second attempts on the same day. Return tomorrow. Aaron backed away from the door, retrieving his shoes. As he walked past the kitchen building, Dina saw the expression on his face. Not anger or resentment, but something closer to fear. That night, Aaron could not sleep. The others in his cabin heard him moving restlessly, muttering the counting ritual over and over. When morning came, he looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. His second attempt at the ritual proceeded flawlessly until the final step. Again, his foot brushed the threshold frame. Again, Stapleton denied him entry. "This is your second failure," Stapleton noted. "Tomorrow you will complete the ritual 3 times in succession before I will permit you to enter." Aaron tried to speak, but no words came. He walked away from the house like a man in a dream. The pattern continued. Each day, Aaron attempted the ritual. Each day, some small error occurred. A miscounted number, a mispronounced word, a foot touching the frame. After a week, Stapleton required him to complete 5 perfect iterations before entry. After 2 weeks, 10, Aaron's health deteriorated visibly. He ate little, slept less, and spent every moment practicing the ritual requirements. The other servants tried to help him, coaching him through the steps, but their assistance seemed only to increase his anxiety. On the morning of November 7th, Aaron attempted the ritual 15 times in succession. 14 times he made small errors. On the 15th attempt, he completed every requirement perfectly. Stapleton watched him approach the threshold, prepared to step over it, and Aaron froze. He stood there, right foot raised, unable to move forward or backward, his body rigid, with something that looked like terror. Seconds passed. Stapleton waited, saying nothing. Finally, Aaron lowered his foot without crossing the threshold. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do it." Stapleton made a note in his journal. "You have failed by forfeit. Tomorrow you will require 20 successful iterations." Aaron turned and walked toward the quarters. An hour later, Joseph Ketch found him hanging from a rafter in the equipment shed. Dr. Wetherb declared the death a suicide, which surprised no one. The enslaved community had seen the deterioration, the growing desperation in Aaron's eyes, but Dina had seen something else. In the days before his death, Aaron had developed a habit of staring at the main house with an expression she could only describe as longing mixed with revulsion, as though the house itself had become something he both needed and feared in equal measure. After Aaron's death, Stapleton made no changes to the ritual requirements. If anything, they grew more elaborate. By December, the posted rules numbered 43, and several were so complex that performing the ritual correctly took nearly 15 minutes. The enslaved community adapted. They practiced the requirements obsessively, helping one another memorize the precise wording of phrases, the exact timing of movements. They developed mnemonics and rhythms to remember the sequence. It became a collective effort of survival, but the fear remained. Everyone understood that the ritual represented more than Stapleton's eccentricity. It had become a form of control more insidious than physical violence, a way of making them police their own movements, their own thoughts, their own adequacy in performing impossible standards. Dina began observing Stapleton more carefully during this period. She noticed that he never performed the ritual himself. He entered and exited his own house freely without any of the preparations he required of others. She also noticed that he seemed to be conducting some kind of experiment, varying the requirements slightly for different individuals, noting their responses in his ever-present journals. In January of 1822, something changed. Stapleton announced that he would be adding what he called advanced requirements to the ritual. These would not apply to everyone immediately, but would be introduced gradually, one person at a time, beginning with those who had demonstrated the most consistent success with the existing requirements. Dina was the first selected for the advanced requirements. The new requirements began simply enough. Stapleton instructed Dina to bring a small object from her cabin each morning, something personal, something meaningful. The first day she brought a clay cup her husband Samuel had made before his sale. Stapleton examined it, weighed it in his hand, then placed it in a cabinet in his study. "This will remain here," he said, "until you fail the ritual. If you maintain perfect performance for 30 consecutive days, the object will be returned to you." The implications were clear. The ritual now held her possessions hostage, a tangible consequence for any mistake. Over the next weeks, Dinina brought other items. A piece of cloth her daughter Ruth had embroidered, a smooth riverstone Marcus had found as a child, a wooden spoon that had belonged to her mother. Each item disappeared into Stapleton's cabinet, and Dinah felt pieces of her life being archived, collected, possessed by this man who already owned her labor, her time, her very existence. But she performed the ritual perfectly. 30 days passed without error, and Stapleton returned the clay cup to her. The relief she felt terrified her that this man's approval, his acknowledgement of her competence in performing meaningless tasks, could generate such emotion. Other servants underwent similar advanced requirements. Julia had to bring samples of her work. Embroidery, laundry she had cleaned, bread she had baked. Thomas had to recite passages from the Bible Stapleton selected each morning, demonstrating not just memory, but proper pronunciation and inflection. Benjamin had to balance specific objects on his head while performing the foot-washing portion of the ritual. The requirements seemed designed to be passed, but only through extraordinary effort and concentration. They created a population of servants who existed in constant vigilance, never relaxing, never allowing their attention to waver. Dinah noticed something else during this period. Those who performed the advanced requirements successfully began to change in subtle ways. They moved differently with a kind of careful precision that extended beyond the ritual itself into their daily work. They spoke more quietly, their words more measured. It was as though the ritual's demands had seeped into every aspect of their behavior. Marcus, now fully healed and working as a house servant, began his advanced requirements in March. Stapleton required him to memorize increasingly complex mathematical sequences, reciting them while performing the physical portions of ritual. Marcus had a good memory, and he approached the task with determination, but Dinah saw the toll it took. Her son, who had once smiled easily despite everything their lives demanded, grew serious, focused, almost obsessive. He practiced his sequences during every spare moment, muttering numbers under his breath while carrying water, while cleaning fireplaces, while lying in his bed at night. One evening in April, Dinah found Marcus sitting outside their cabin staring at the main house. "Mama," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder what he's trying to prove?" "What do you mean?" "All these rituals, all these requirements. He writes everything down in those journals. He's studying us. But what is he trying to prove?" Dinah had wondered the same thing, but had suppressed the question, feeling it was dangerous even to think too deeply about Stapleton's motivations. "I don't know," she said. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "he's trying to see how much control he can have, not just over our bodies, but over our minds, over every single thing we do." The observation chilled Dinah because it felt true. The ritual was not about cleanliness or order or any practical purpose. It was about demonstrating that Stapleton could require absolute precision in meaningless tasks and receive it. That he could occupy their thoughts so completely that they policed themselves more effectively than any overseer could. In May, Stapleton introduced what he called variable requirements. These changed daily, posted each morning beside the basin. One day might require counting in French, a language none of them spoke, forcing them to learn the numbers phonetically from Stapleton's instruction. Another day might demand they hold their breath while submerging their feet. A third might require them to complete the entire ritual with their eyes closed. The unpredictability was the point. It ensured they could never feel confident, never approached the ritual without anxiety about what new demand might await them. On a humid morning in June, Dinah arrived at the basin to find a new requirement posted. Those entering must present a truth about themselves never before spoken aloud. She stared at the words, feeling something cold settle in her chest. What truth could she safely speak in front of Stapleton? What confession would satisfy this requirement without giving him power over something deeper than he already possessed? When her turn came, she stepped into the basin, counted to 30, recited the familiar phrases, and then, facing east with her feet still damp, said, I remember every kindness anyone has ever shown me. Every single one. It was true. In a life marked by cruelty and deprivation, kindness stood out with absolute clarity. She remembered Thomas Grimble teaching her the alphabet when she was 6. She remembered her husband Samuel sharing his small ration of salt pork with her when she was pregnant with Ruth. She remembered Julia sitting with her through a night when grief made breathing difficult. Stapleton wrote in his notebook for a long time after she spoke. "That will suffice," he finally said, but Dina felt violated in a way physical violence had never achieved. He had taken something private, something that belonged to the core of who she was, and made her speak it aloud as a condition of entry to his house. Other servants faced similar demands. Thomas had to confess his greatest fear, that he would die without ever learning to read well enough to understand the Bible in its entirety. Julia had to admit that she sometimes hated her surviving children because they reminded her of the daughter she had lost. Benjamin revealed that he had once stolen food and let another man take the punishment. Each confession went into Stapleton's notebooks. Each became another form of possession, but something began to shift among the servants during this period. The ritual designed to control and separate them began to create unexpected solidarity. They shared the burden of the requirements, practiced together, supported one another through failures and successes. When Benjamin struggled with a particularly difficult sequence of movements, Thomas spent hours helping him master it. When Julia needed to memorize a passage in Latin, Dinina, who remembered fragments from her childhood lessons with the Grimble children, helped her learn the pronunciation. They were united not in rebellion, but in collective survival of impossible standards. Then in August, Stapleton made a mistake. He selected Ruth, Diner's 14-year-old daughter, for the advanced requirements. Ruth worked in the kitchen building, and while she occasionally entered the main house to deliver meals or clean dishes, she had never been subjected to the elaborate ritual protocols required of the primary house servants, but Stapleton, expanding his experiment, decided to include her. Dinina felt fear unlike anything she had experienced in years. Her daughter was young, still relatively innocent of the cruelties that would eventually define her existence. The ritual would change her, would introduce her to a level of psychological control the diner had hoped to spare her for at least a few more years. But there was no way to refuse, no way to protect Ruth from Stapleton's attention. Ruth's first attempt at the ritual occurred on a Tuesday morning. Dinina watched from the kitchen door as her daughter approached the basin, removed her shoes, and stepped into the water. Ruth's voice, young and uncertain, counted to 30. She recited the required phrases with only slight hesitation. She stepped over the threshold without touching the frame. Stapleton wrote in his notebook and dismissed her. She had passed, but Dina saw the change immediately. Ruth returned to the kitchen with a new weariness in her eyes, a new understanding of the attention required to survive in Stapleton's house. For 2 weeks, Ruth performed the ritual successfully. Then Stapleton assigned her an advanced requirement. She must bring samples of her cooking each morning, and he would taste them and rate their quality. Only if the rating exceeded his arbitrary threshold would she be permitted entry. The requirement was cruel in its subjectivity. There were no clear standards, no way to guarantee success. Ruth's competence became dependent entirely on Stapleton's mood and judgment. Dinina tried to help her daughter prepare the best possible food, but they had limited ingredients, limited time, and no understanding of Stapleton's preferences. Ruth brought cornbread one morning, and Stapleton deemed it acceptable. She brought rice cakes another morning, and he called them inferior. She brought a carefully prepared fish soup, and he praised it, then required her to prepare it identically the next day. But her second attempt, using slightly different fish from the river, was declared inadequate. The failures mounted. Ruth began to panic, losing sleep, becoming obsessed with her cooking in the same way others had become obsessed with counting or memorization. She started making mistakes in other areas of her work, dropping dishes, burning bread, forgetting basic tasks. Dinina watched her daughter deteriorate with helpless fury. This was different from her own experience with the ritual. Ruth was younger, less hardened by years of navigating impossible demands. The ritual was breaking something in her that might never repair. On a September morning, Ruth arrived at the basin with a small cake she had made from hoarded ingredients. Flour she had saved from her rations, honey she had traded for, nuts Marcus had gathered. She presented it to Stapleton with hands that visibly trembled. He tasted it, he considered, he wrote in his notebook. "Insufficient," he said. "You may not enter today." Ruth stood frozen for a moment, then quietly she said, "Please." The word hung in the air. Dina, watching from the kitchen, felt her heart contract. "Please," Ruth said again. "I tried so hard. I did everything I could." Stapleton looked at her with an expression Dinina could not read. "The ritual requires adequacy. You have not demonstrated adequacy. Return tomorrow." Ruth didn't move. She stood there holding her small cake, tears beginning to slide down her face. "I can't do it perfectly," she whispered. "I can't make it exactly right every time. Nobody can." For just a moment, something flickered across Stapleton's face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, but then his expression hardened again. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will require 2 dishes instead of 1. You will need to demonstrate improvement." He turned and entered his house, leaving Ruth standing beside the basin with her rejected offering. That night, Dina held her crying daughter and felt something she had kept carefully suppressed for months crystallize into clarity. The ritual was not sustainable. It would eventually break all of them, or they would have to find some way to resist it. But resistance seemed impossible. What could they do? Refuse to perform the ritual? That would mean punishment. Possibly sail, possibly worse. Perform it incorrectly on purpose, same result. There seemed no way to challenge Stapleton's control without destroying themselves in the process. Then Marcus came to their cabin with news that changed everything. He had been cleaning Stapleton's study that afternoon and had accidentally knocked over a stack of journals. While gathering them, he had glimpsed pages covered in detailed notes, sketches, calculations, and he had read one sentence that made no sense yet felt crucial. Subject compliance increases proportionally with ritual complexity, but subject psychological stability shows inverse correlation after threshold of 41 requirements. "He knows," Marcus said quietly. "He knows the ritual is breaking people. He's measuring it. It's not madness. It's a deliberate experiment." Dinina stared at her son. The implications were staggering. If Stapleton was consciously studying their responses to increasing control, documenting their deterioration, then he was not simply a tyrant, but something more calculating and cruel. A man treating human beings as objects of scientific inquiry. "Did you see anything else?" Dinina asked. "Just fragments. Something about comparative analysis and control mechanisms, and one phrase that I memorized because it seemed important. The question is not whether absolute compliance can be achieved, but whether subjects can be made to desire their own compliance." That phrase haunted Diner through the night. Stapleton was not just controlling their behavior. He was trying to make them internalize that control, to make them want to perform the ritual perfectly, to make them judge themselves by his arbitrary standards. And he was succeeding. She thought of Aaron driven to suicide by his inability to meet the requirements. She thought of Benjamin's tremor, Julia's perpetual anxiety, Ruth's tears. She thought of herself, feeling relief when Stapleton approved her ritual performance, feeling shame when she stumbled. He had gotten inside all of their heads. The next morning, Dina made a decision. She would fail the ritual deliberately, but in a way that appeared accidental, a way that would allow her to observe Stapleton's response without triggering immediate punishment. She approached the basin as usual, removed her shoes, stepped into the water. She counted to 30, her voice steady. She recited the required phrases. She moved toward the threshold, prepared to step over with her right foot, and at the last moment, she let her foot touch the frame. The contact was slight, but unmistakable. She had failed the ritual. Stapleton's pen hovered over his notebook. "You have failed the threshold requirement," he said, but there was something in his voice, a hint of surprise perhaps, or curiosity. Dinina had been performing the ritual perfectly for months. This error seemed out of character. "I apologize, sir," Dinina said, keeping her voice neutral. "May I attempt again tomorrow?" "Yes," Stapleton said slowly, "but I'm curious. You have completed this ritual successfully 213 consecutive times. Why do you think you failed today?" It was the first time he had ever asked such a question. Dina chose her words carefully. "I was distracted, sir, thinking about my daughter's difficulties with her own requirements." Stapleton studied her. "And what do you think about those difficulties?" "I think," Dina said, feeling she was stepping into dangerous territory but unable to stop herself, "that she's trying as hard as she can, that sometimes trying isn't enough." "Precisely," Stapleton said, and there was something almost eager in his tone. "That is precisely the point. Effort without result is meaningless. The ritual demands results." "But sir," Dina said, and now she was truly taking a risk, "some of the requirements change so frequently that no one can be certain they'll succeed. The unpredictability makes success partially a matter of chance." Stapleton's eyes sharpened. "You have been thinking about this?" "Yes, sir." He wrote something in his notebook, a longer passage than his usual brief notations. Then he did something unexpected. He gestured toward the interior of his house. "Come inside. We will continue this conversation in my study." Dinina felt her heart accelerate. She had failed the ritual. She should not be permitted entry. Yet Stapleton was inviting her in, breaking his own rules. She followed him through the doorway, her damp feet leaving prints on the polished floor. His study was exactly as Marcus had described it. Walls lined with journals, a large desk covered in papers, the cabinet where he stored the personal objects taken from servants who failed to maintain perfect performance. Stapleton gestured to a chair, and after a moment's hesitation, Dinina sat. She could not remember the last time she had been invited to sit in a white person's presence. "You are the most consistent performer of the ritual," Stapleton said, settling into his own chair behind the desk. "In 14 months, you have failed only once just now. Your daughter, by contrast, has failed 37 times. Thomas has failed 12 times. Benjamin 19. Do you know why your success rate is so much higher?" "No, sir." "Neither do I," Stapleton admitted, and there was genuine frustration in his voice. "That is what makes you interesting. Professor Lockheed believes that success correlates with intelligence and memory capacity, but Thomas is more educated than you. He can read and write fluently, yet he fails more often. Julia has excellent manual dexterity and attention to detail, qualities that should predict ritual success, yet she fails frequently. You, however, rarely fail. Why?" Diner considered lying, offering some safe explanation, but Stapleton's eagerness suggested he genuinely wanted to understand, and perhaps in that desire lay some opportunity she could not yet see clearly. "I think," she said slowly, "it's because I don't believe the ritual means anything." Stapleton leaned forward. "Explain the others. Thomas, Julia, Benjamin. They're trying to find meaning in the requirements. They're trying to understand why you demand these specific actions, what purpose they serve. That makes them anxious because the requirements don't have rational purposes. They're arbitrary. But I understood that from the beginning. I perform the ritual the way I would perform any other task you assign me. I don't think about it beyond the mechanics. I just do it." For a long moment, Stapleton said nothing. Then he opened one of his journals and began reading aloud. October 7th, 1821. Subject: A. That's you, Dina. Demonstrates unusual psychological detachment from ritual requirements, while other subjects show increasing emotional investment in successful performance. Subject: A. Maintains mechanical efficiency without apparent anxiety. Hypothesis: perhaps the most effective control is achieved not through creating belief in the ritual's meaning, but through creating such perfect indifference that subjects perform requirements automatically without conscious thought. He looked up at her. I wrote that 8 months ago. You had already recognized what I was only beginning to understand. The ritual works best when people stop thinking about it at all, when it becomes as natural and unquestioned as breathing. But that's not what's happened, Dina said, surprising herself with her boldness. Everyone thinks about it constantly. They practice in their sleep. They dream about it. Aaron died because he couldn't stop thinking about it. Yes, Stapleton said, and his tone carried something that might have been regret. That was an unfortunate outcome. I had not anticipated that level of psychological deterioration. Professor Lockheed suggests I pushed the complexity too rapidly with new subjects. He advises a more gradual introduction of requirements. You could stop entirely, Dina said. You could let people enter your house like normal human beings. Stapleton looked at her as though she had suggested something incomprehensible. But then I would learn nothing. The question that drives this research is fundamental. How much control can one human exert over another's mind? Not through violence, which is crude and ultimately limited, but through systematic psychological conditioning. If I can make you perform elaborate, meaningless tasks with perfect precision simply because I demand it, then I have achieved something far more profound than simple obedience. I have demonstrated that human consciousness itself can be shaped and directed like water through channels. But we're not water, Dina said quietly. We're people, are you? Stapleton asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, as though the question were philosophical rather than monstrous. How do I know? Your owner, that is, I purchase you, transport you, employ you in labor. I can sell you, trade you, will you to my heirs. In every legal sense, you are property, no different from the rice in my fields or the furniture in this house. Yet you speak, you think, you apparently feel emotions similar to mine. It's a fascinating paradox. The ritual helps me explore that paradox. If you truly possess consciousness equivalent to mine, then the ritual should affect you the way it would affect me. It should create resistance, rebellion, refusal, but you continue to perform it. What does that suggest? Dina felt something crystallize in her mind, a clarity that came from pure anger transformed into cold understanding. It suggests that survival sometimes requires performing what's demanded while keeping your true thoughts hidden. It suggests that you've created conditions where resistance means death or separation from everyone we love. It suggests that we choose to live even when living means doing things that disgust us. That's not proof we lack consciousness. That's proof we possess it. We understand the consequences of refusal and make calculated decisions about how to survive. Stapleton wrote rapidly in his journal, his pen scratching across the page with evident excitement. Yes, exactly. Strategic performance despite internal resistance. That's the phenomenon Lead has been theorizing about. He calls it compliant consciousness, the ability to maintain private mental resistance while performing public submission. But here's what interests me. How long can that internal resistance persist? If I require the ritual for years, decades, will you still maintain that private rejection of its meaning, or will performance eventually become the reality? Will you forget that you once thought differently? I won't forget, Dina said. Are you certain? Memory is unreliable. Identity is malleable. 5 years ago, could you have imagined performing these rituals as automatically as you do now? Could you have imagined a version of yourself who steps into that basin every morning without feeling the absurdity of it? Yet here you are. You've already changed more than you probably realize. The words struck something deep in Dina's chest because they carried truth. She had changed. The ritual had become automatic in ways that disturbed her when she allowed herself to think about it. She no longer felt the outrage that had consumed her during those first weeks. She simply performed the requirement efficiently, her mind occupied with thoughts about her children, her work, her memories, anything except the ritual itself. Was that adaptation, or was it a kind of slow eraser of her capacity for resistance? Return tomorrow, Stapleton said, closing his journal. Perform the ritual correctly. We will continue these conversations. You're providing valuable data. Dina left the study feeling she had opened something she could not close. She had challenged Stapleton directly, admitted to thinking critically about his ritual, shown that she understood its mechanics and its psychological purpose, and instead of punishing her, he had welcomed her insight, incorporated it into his research. made her complicit in her own analysis. That night, Marcus returned to their cabin with more information. He had found an opportunity to look more carefully at Stapleton's journals while cleaning the study. What he discovered made the nature of Stapleton's experiment clearer and more disturbing. "He's been corresponding with someone," Marcus said. "Letters from a professor, Richard Lougheed at Harvard College. They're discussing something called behavioral modification through systematic ritual. Stapleton has been documenting our responses and sending detailed reports to this professor. There are letters going back 2 years, starting before Stapleton even arrived at Hartwell Landing. This whole thing was planned from the beginning, so we're not even his idea." Dinina said, "We're part of someone else's theory. There's more." Marcus said, "I found a letter from Locke. He dated last month. It says Stapleton should be looking for spontaneous resistance as a sign that subjects have reached what he calls psychological capacity. Here the letter specifically says that when subjects begin to question the ritual openly, that's when the most interesting phase of the experiment begins. It says, and I memorized this exactly, the subject who questions is the subject who has integrated the ritual deeply enough to recognize its mechanisms. Such subjects become invaluable for understanding the limits of conditioning." Dinina felt cold. Her conversation with Stapleton that morning suddenly looked different. She had not challenged him. She had given him exactly what he was waiting for. Her resistance had become data. Her insight transformed into evidence, supporting his theories. "There was something else," Marcus continued, his voice dropping even lower. "A letter from Stapleton to Lougheed describing Aaron's death. He wrote, Subject G's suicide represents a failure of the graduated complexity model. However, it also demonstrates the ritual's capacity to create such profound psychological investment that subjects prefer death to continued failure. This suggests the ritual achieves genuine psychological penetration, not merely superficial behavioral compliance. Recommendation: future subjects should undergo more extensive preliminary conditioning before introduction to advanced requirements." The clinical language describing Aaron's desperation and death made Diner's stomach turn. "He's treating us like experiments in a laboratory." "He is," Marcus said, "and there's going to be a demonstration next month in Charleston. He's planning to show other planters how the ritual works, prove that psychological control is more effective than physical punishment. We're going to be exhibited like trained animals, performing our rituals while he lectures about conditioning and compliance." Over the next weeks, Stapleton changed his approach with Dina. He began engaging her in longer conversations about the ritual, asking her opinion on its requirements, inquiring about how other servants responded to various demands. It felt almost like respect, as though her critical thinking made her more interesting to him rather than dangerous. But Dina understood what was happening. She was being studied even more closely now, her resistance itself becoming part of the experiment. Stapleton was documenting how she maintained what he called compliant consciousness, using her as an example of someone who could recognize the ritual's mechanisms while still performing it flawlessly. Other servants noticed the change. Thomas approached her one evening with a question that had clearly been building. "Are you collaborating with him?" The accusation stung, but Dina understood it. From the outside, her conversations with Stapleton might look like cooperation, like she was helping him refine his methods of control. "No," she said, "but I'm trying to understand what he's doing. Maybe if we understand it, we can find a way to." She trailed off. "A way to what?" "Resist, escape, survive." All those goals seemed equally impossible. "He's using your intelligence against us," Thomas said, not unkindly, but with evident concern. "Every observation you share with him, he turns into a new requirement or a modification to the ritual. You're helping him make it more effective." The words landed with brutal accuracy. Dina had been telling herself she was gathering information, understanding the enemy, preparing for some eventual resistance. But Thomas was right. Her conversations with Stapleton had led directly to new ritual requirements, new tests, new ways of measuring and controlling their behavior. She had become complicit without even recognizing it. "Then we need to use that," Dina said, making a decision. "If he's listening to what I say, Then I can give him information that seems useful, but actually weakens the ritual rather than strengthening it. How? I don't know yet, but there has to be a way to make him think he's achieving greater control while actually creating conditions for resistance. It was a fragile hope, barely more than a wish, but it was something. In October, Stapleton made his announcement about the Charleston demonstration. He gathered all the house servants and explained that they would be traveling to the city to demonstrate the ritual for an audience of planters, scientists, and academics. They would show the precision they had achieved, the complexity they could manage, the perfect compliance he had cultivated. The enslaved community understood immediately what this meant. They were not just subjects of an experiment, but exhibits, proof of Stapleton's theories about control and compliance. They would be paraded before wealthy white men. Their perfect performance of meaningless tasks offered as evidence that human consciousness could be systematically shaped and directed. But they also understood they had no choice. To refuse would be to risk everything: punishment, sale, separation from family. The demonstration would happen whether they consented or not. Then 3 days before the scheduled demonstration, something happened that changed everything. Ruth approached Dina in the kitchen building, her face set with determination. "I'm going to speak," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" "At the demonstration, when it's my turn, I'm going to tell them what the ritual really is, what it's really for." Dina felt fear flood through her. "Ruth, no, they'll punish you, they'll sell you, I know," Ruth interrupted. "But Mama, if I don't speak, if none of us ever speak, then Stapleton wins. He gets to present his research, show us off like we're proof that people can be broken and controlled, and then other planters will adopt his methods. The ritual will spread. More people will suffer what we've suffered. Someone has to name what's happening. Someone has to make them see us as people who understand what's being done to us, not as objects that have been successfully trained." "Let me do it," Dina said immediately. "I'm older. I've already had my children. You're young. You have your whole life." "What life?" Ruth asked, and there was such weary wisdom in her voice. The diner fell silent. "What life do I have really? Working every day until I'm too old or sick to be useful, then dying in a cabin like this one. Maybe having children who will be sold away or who will suffer the same life I've suffered. That's not a life worth protecting by staying silent." "But speaking won't change anything," Dina said, and heard the desperation in her own voice. "They won't listen. They'll just punish you and continue with their plans." "Maybe," Ruth said, "but at least Olive said it. At least there will be one moment when someone told the truth in front of all those powerful men. At least they'll have to hear. Even if they don't listen, that matters, Mama. It has to matter." Dina wanted to argue further to forbid her daughter from this dangerous act, but she recognized the expression on Ruth's face. It was the same determination she herself had felt when deciding to fail the ritual deliberately, the same stubborn insistence on agency, even in the face of impossible circumstances. "Then we'll all speak," Dina said finally. "If you're going to do this, you won't do it alone. We'll coordinate. Make it impossible for them to dismiss as one person's madness or rebellion." That night, the servants gathered in secret discussion. Not everyone wanted to participate in what Ruth was proposing. Some feared the consequences too deeply, and no one blamed them. But enough agreed to make the demonstration into something very different from what Stapleton was planning. They practiced in whispers, refining what they would say, how they would say it, timing their statements to build on each other's words. They were careful, knowing that if Stapleton suspected anything, he would cancel the demonstration or remove anyone he thought might cause problems. The morning they left for Charleston, Dina watched Ruth carefully. Her daughter showed no signs of nervousness, no indication of what she was planning. She performed her ritual that morning with perfect precision. As always on the journey to Charleston, Stapleton discussed his expectations. "You will demonstrate the ritual exactly as you perform it at home. Answer any questions the audience may have. Show them the precision you've achieved. This is an opportunity to prove the value of systematic psychological conditioning. Do you understand? They all nodded. They understood perfectly. The Charleston demonstration took place on November 15, 1822, in the Grand Ballroom of the Planters Hotel. 73 planters and scientists attended along with Professor Lougheed from Harvard College. A basin had been set up at one end of the room, transported specially from Hartwell Landing. The copper gleamed under the ballroom chandelier light, and someone had arranged chairs in a semicircle to give the audience an optimal view. Stapleton stood beside a lectern, dressed in his finest black coat, holding his journals and prepared remarks. Professor Lougheed sat in the front row, his expression eager with anticipation. This was the culmination of their 2 years of correspondence and research. The moment when theory would be demonstrated through living evidence. Dinina was scheduled to perform first, followed by Thomas, Julia, Benjamin, Marcus, and finally Ruth. Each would complete the full ritual, including their advanced requirements, while Stapleton lectured on his methods and findings. Gentlemen, Stapleton began addressing the assembled planters and scientists. What you are about to witness represents a breakthrough in the scientific management of enslaved labor. For generations, planters have relied primarily on physical punishment to ensure compliance. But physical punishment is inefficient. It creates resentment, reduces productivity through injury, and requires constant supervision. What I have developed is a system of psychological conditioning that creates compliance from within. Subjects learn to police themselves, to desire perfection in even arbitrary tasks, to measure their own worth by their success in meeting demands that I, their master, have established. He gestured toward Dinina. Subject A, Dinina, has performed this ritual successfully 247 consecutive times over 14 months. She will demonstrate the basic requirements followed by her advanced protocols. The audience watched with interest as Dinah approached the basin. She removed her shoes, noting how strange the familiar action felt in this grand room full of watching eyes. She stepped into the water, counted to 30 with perfect precision. Her voice carried through the ballroom with practiced clarity. 1, 2, 3, 4. She recited the required phrases. I enter this house with clear purpose. I bring nothing hidden. I leave nothing concealed. She presented her personal object, the clay cup Samuel had made, and explained its significance as Stapleton had taught her to do. This cup was made by my husband before he was sold to Savannah. I have maintained it for 6 years. Its presence in my ritual represents my commitment to preserving what matters despite circumstances beyond my control. The words felt like truth wrapped in lies. The cup did matter to her, but not for the reasons Stapleton presented. It mattered because it was one of the few physical connections to Samuel she still possessed, a reminder that she had once been loved by someone who saw her as fully human. She stepped over the threshold without touching the frame and stood ready for questions. Stapleton addressed the audience. As you can see, Subject A has internalized the ritual completely. The precision is not the result of fear, but of genuine psychological integration. She performs these actions because she has come to understand their necessity. One planter raised his hand, a heavy-set man with the red face of someone who drank too freely. But what is their necessity? What practical purpose does foot-washing serve? An excellent question, Stapleton said, warming to his lecture. None. That is precisely the point. The ritual's power lies in its arbitrariness. When subjects can be made to perform meaningless tasks with perfect precision, you have achieved true control. Not over their bodies, but over their minds, their capacity for judgment, their sense of what constitutes meaningful resistance. A subject who will count to 30 before entering a house simply because I demand it, who will recite phrases that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating obedience, who will submit even their personal possessions to my judgment. That subject has been fundamentally transformed. The ritual rewrites their understanding of what is normal, what is required, what is possible to refuse. He gestured for Thomas to begin. Thomas approached the basin, performed his foot washing flawlessly, and then recited the biblical passage Stapleton had selected for him. Ephesians 6:5. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in singleness of your heart as unto Christ. The audience murmured approvingly. Several planters took notes. Professor Lougheed leaned forward in his seat, nodding with evident satisfaction. Stapleton continued his lecture. Notice how Subject C incorporates religious doctrine into his ritual performance. This demonstrates the flexibility of the conditioning model. The ritual can be adapted to reinforce existing social structures, religious obedience, racial hierarchy, gender subordination. The psychological mechanisms are transferable across contexts. Julia approached next. She performed her ritual with the same meticulous precision, including her advanced requirement of presenting embroidery samples for Stapleton's judgment. She had brought 3 pieces: a handkerchief with delicate edging, a pillowcase with floral patterns, a small cloth with her initials worked in careful script. Stapleton examined each piece, discussing their quality with the audience as though Julia were not standing right there, as though she were truly an object to be evaluated rather than a person capable of hearing and feeling his assessments. Notice the fine motor control, he said, holding up the handkerchief. This level of precision extends beyond the ritual itself into all aspects of the subject's work. That is the ultimate goal, to create self-regulating workers who bring ritualistic perfectionism to every task, not because they fear punishment, but because they have internalized the standards I have established. Benjamin followed, then Marcus. Each performance was flawless. Each servant demonstrated perfect compliance with increasingly elaborate requirements. The audience watched with growing fascination as the complexity became evident. The precise timing, the perfect memorization, the absolute consistency. Professor Lougheed rose to ask a question. Mr. Stapleton, have you observed any long-term psychological effects from sustained ritual performance? Any degradation of mental capacity or signs of resistance? An insightful question, Professor Stapleton said. Initially, yes, there were some unfortunate outcomes. One subject experienced such severe anxiety about ritual performance that he took his own life, but I have since refined the progressive introduction of requirements. Current subjects show remarkable psychological resilience. In fact, I would argue they demonstrate enhanced mental capacity, improved memory, heightened attention to detail, superior self-discipline. The ritual strengthens rather than weakens cognitive function, provided it is introduced at an appropriate pace. He did not mention Aaron's name, did not acknowledge the human being who had died trying to meet impossible standards. Aaron had become merely one subject, a data point in a failed experiment. His death reduced to a lesson about pacing rather than a tragedy about cruelty. Then Ruth approached the basin for the final demonstration. She removed her shoes, her movements calm and deliberate. The ballroom had grown warm with the press of bodies and the heat of candles. Somewhere outside, a church bell tolled the hour. Ruth stepped into the water. She counted to 30, her voice young and clear. She recited the required phrases. She presented her 2 dishes, the required cornbread and the voluntary cake she had begun bringing weeks earlier. She explained, as Stapleton had instructed her to do, how the ritual had taught her to strive for perfection, even when not explicitly demanded. The ritual has shown me, Ruth said, her voice carrying to the back of the ballroom, that excellence requires constant vigilance, that even small failures can have significant consequences, that my worth is measured by my ability to meet standards established by those who own me. Stapleton nodded approvingly, not yet sensing the shift in Ruth's tone. Ruth continued, her eyes moving across the assembled audience. It has taught me that my thoughts, my efforts, my very identity exist only insofar as they serve the purposes of my master, that I should practice submission until it becomes natural, that I should measure my success by his approval and my failure by his disappointment. She paused, and in that pause the room's attention sharpened. "But there is something else the ritual has taught me," Ruth said, and now her voice carried an edge that made Stapleton stiffen. "It has taught me that cruelty can be disguised as science, that exploitation can be presented as improvement, that breaking human beings can be described as conditioning, as though we were horses or dogs rather than people with thoughts and feelings as complex as any of yours." Stapleton moved toward her, his face darkening. "You will be silent. I am being honest as the ritual requires," Ruth said, not moving from her position beside the basin. "You wrote the rule yourself. I enter this house with clear purpose, bringing nothing hidden. My purpose is to work, to survive, to maintain whatever dignity remains possible in this life you control. Your purpose is to demonstrate that people like me can be controlled so completely that we forget we're human, that we come to judge ourselves by your standards, measure our worth by your approval, fear our own thoughts because they might make us fail your arbitrary tests." She turned to face the audience directly. "That's what this demonstration is really showing you, not that ritual works, but that you can make people participate in their own degradation. If you make the requirements complicated enough, you can make them practice their submission until it looks like skill. You can measure and document and analyze their responses until their suffering becomes data in your journals. But you cannot make them believe your justifications. You cannot make them forget they're human." The room had gone completely silent. Professor Lockheed's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. Stapleton grabbed Ruth's arm, but Marcus stepped forward from his position, and then Denina, and then Thomas, Julia, and Benjamin. They didn't threaten, didn't speak. They simply formed a barrier between Ruth and immediate violence, their bodies present and solid, their eyes on the audience rather than on Stapleton. "We perform your rituals," Denina said, speaking for the first time without being called upon. "We count to 30 and recite your phrases and present our possessions. For your judgment, we do this because the alternative is worse. Punishment, sale, separation from our families. But don't mistake our performance for acceptance. Don't mistake our compliance for belief. We understand exactly what you're doing. We understand that you've created a system designed to make us doubt our own thoughts, question our own worth, internalize your authority until it becomes indistinguishable from our own judgment." Thomas continued, his voice steady. "You talk about psychological conditioning as though it's a scientific breakthrough, but what you've really discovered is how to make people hate themselves for failing to meet standards that were designed to be almost impossible. How to make us compete with each other for your approval. How to make our children practice counting in their sleep because they fear what will happen if they fail." "That's enough," Stapleton said, his voice shaking with fury. "All of you will be punished for this insubordination." "Punished for what?" Julia interrupted. "For telling the truth, for saying aloud what everyone in this room already knows but doesn't want to acknowledge. You wanted to demonstrate psychological conditioning. We're demonstrating it. We're showing these gentlemen exactly how your ritual works, not by performing it silently, but by naming what it does to people's minds and hearts." Benjamin spoke last, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the ballroom. "My hands shake now. They never did before. I shake because I spent 6 months learning to count in exactly the rhythm you demanded. And when I couldn't do it perfectly, you made me practice for hours until something in my body broke. You documented that in your journals. You wrote about it in your letters to the professor, but you never asked what it felt like. You never considered that the data you're collecting represents actual human suffering." The room erupted. Planters shouted at Stapleton, demanding explanations. Some of the anger was directed at the servant's speech, calling it rebellion and insubordination, but much of it was directed at Stapleton himself, at the exposure of his methods, at the revelation that his scientific approach was simply elaborate cruelty dressed in academic language. Professor Lougheed rose from his seat, his face furious. "This is disgraceful," he said, though whether he meant the servant's speech or Stapleton's loss of control was unclear. "I was assured that subjects had been properly conditioned. This demonstration proves nothing except failure of fundamental methodology." On the contrary, a voice said from the back of the room. A man stood, older than most of the planters, wearing the simple clothes of a Quaker. "This demonstration has proven something quite profound. These people, subjected to months of elaborate psychological manipulation, remain capable of clear analysis and articulate resistance. They can name what is being done to them. They understand both the mechanics and the purpose of their oppression. That does not suggest failure of conditioning. It suggests the inherent impossibility of truly destroying human consciousness through ritual compliance. "Who are you?" Stapleton demanded. "Benjamin Lundy," the man said. "I publish the genius of universal emancipation. I came to this demonstration because I heard disturbing rumors about experiments being conducted on enslaved people. Now I have witnessed those experiments myself, and I have heard the testimony of their victims. I will be writing about what I have seen. Today, I will be sharing these people's words with readers throughout the country, and I will be asking what it says about our society that we allow such cruelty to be practiced in the name of science and profit." The demonstration ended in chaos. Planters argued with each other, with Stapleton, with Professor Lougheed. Some were angry at the servants' resistance. Others seemed disturbed by the revelation of Stapleton's methods, not necessarily out of moral objection, but because the failure of the demonstration suggested the techniques might not be as effective as promised. In confusion, Benjamin Lundy approached the group of servants standing by the basin. "I want to hear more from all of you," he said quietly. "I want to document what you've experienced. Would you be willing to speak with me?" "We don't have that choice," Dinina said. "We belong to Mr. Stapleton. He decides who we speak with." "Then I will write what I have heard today," Lundy said. "And I will make sure your words are not forgotten." As the audience dispersed, still arguing, Stapleton gathered his servants with cold fury evident in every line of his body. "We are returning to Hartwell Landing immediately," he said, "and there will be consequences for what has happened here today." The journey back was silent. Stapleton rode in his carriage while the servants walked behind under the supervision of Joseph Ketch, who had accompanied them to Charleston. Ketch said nothing, but his expression suggested he took a certain grim satisfaction in knowing punishment awaited. They arrived at Hartwell Landing after dark. Stapleton immediately summoned all the house servants to the main house, requiring them to perform the ritual despite the late hour and their exhaustion. One by one, they stepped into the basin, counted to 30, recited the phrases, crossed the threshold. Each performance was perfect, executed with mechanical precision despite their anxiety about what would come next. When the last person had entered, Stapleton addressed them. "Ruth will be sold. I have already sent word to a buyer in Georgia who specializes in purchasing difficult slaves. Her sale price will be deducted from the food rations allocated to all house servants for the next 12 months. Her punishment is collective. Everyone will remember that her actions cost them personally and directly." The cruelty of the decision was calculated. By making Ruth's punishment collective, Stapleton ensured that the other servants would resent her resistance rather than honor it. He was creating conditions where they would police each other, where resistance would be punished not just by authorities, but by the very people who should support it. "The ritual will continue," Stapleton said. "In fact, it will expand. I am adding new requirements, more complex protocols. What happened in Charleston proves that psychological conditioning requires more rigorous application, not less. You demonstrated that you retain capacity for resistance. That capacity must be eliminated." He dismissed them, and they returned to their quarters in devastated silence. But something had shifted subtly and perhaps irreversibly. That night, the servants gathered in quiet discussion. They had no power to stop Ruth's sale, no way to prevent the new ritual requirements, no means of challenging Stapleton's control. But they could honor what Ruth had done. "You showed them," Julia said quietly. "You made them see us. They saw," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "But I don't know if they understood. And tomorrow I'll be gone, and the ritual will continue, and nothing will change." Dinina held her daughter. "Something changed," she said. "You proved that understanding what's being done to you is itself a form of resistance, that naming it matters. They can control our bodies, our time, our labor, but they can't make us believe their justifications. They can't make us forget we're human. They can't make us accept that what they call science is anything other than cruelty with documentation. Will anyone remember? Ruth asked. Will anyone know that we tried to speak? Benjamin Lundy will write about it. Thomas said. He'll tell people what happened in that ballroom and will remember. Marcus added. We'll tell the story to others. We'll make sure that anyone who comes to Hartwell Landing understands what the ritual really is, what it's really for. Ruth was sold the next morning to a buyer named Crawford Pettigrew, who operated a turpentine plantation in southern Georgia. Denina stood in the yard and watched her daughter leave in Pettigrew's wagon, knowing she would almost certainly never see Ruth again. The Georgia turpentine camps were notorious for their brutal conditions. Few survived more than a few years. As the wagon disappeared down the river road, Denina felt something harden in her chest. Not acceptance, she would never accept what was happening, but a cold understanding that this was the reality they inhabited, and that small acts of resistance were all they had. Ruth's speech had not stopped the ritual. It had not freed anyone or changed Stapleton's mind, but it had created a moment of truth in a ballroom full of powerful men. A moment when the victims of oppression had named their oppression clearly and refused to participate in the fiction that their compliance indicated acceptance. That had to count for something. It had to. The ritual at Hartwell Landing continued, growing more elaborate with each passing month. By spring of 1823, the requirements numbered 57. By 1825, 63. Stapleton never mentioned the Charleston demonstration again, never acknowledged what had happened in that ballroom. But the servants noticed changes in his approach. He no longer asked them questions about their thoughts or experiences. He no longer engaged them in conversations about the ritual's purposes. He had retreated entirely into documentation, observing and recording their performances without attempting to understand the consciousness behind their compliance. Professor Lowe he'd stopped corresponding after the Charleston incident. The academic community, such as it was, had apparently decided that Stapleton's research was too controversial, too publicly exposed to support openly. But Stapleton continued his work anyway, driven by something beyond academic recognition, a need to prove that absolute psychological control was possible, that human consciousness could be systematically reshaped through ritual requirements. Benjamin Lundy published an article about the Charleston demonstration in the June 1823 issue of The Genius of Universal Emancipation. He described the ritual in detail, quoted Ruth's speech extensively, and raised questions about what it meant that enslaved people could be subjected to such elaborate psychological manipulation. In the name of agricultural efficiency, the article was reprinted in several northern newspapers, generating discussion among abolitionists about the nature of slavery's cruelties. But in South Carolina, the article changed nothing. If anything, it made conditions worse for those at Hartwell Landing. As Stapleton grew more determined to prove his theories in the face of public criticism, the servants adapted. They continued performing the ritual, helping one another master new requirements, supporting each other through failures and successes. They developed a collective memory of Ruth's resistance, passing down her words to newer members of the community, ensuring that her speech in that Charleston ballroom would not be forgotten, even if it had not changed their immediate circumstances. Denina performed the ritual faithfully for 26 years until Stapleton's death in 1847. By then, the ritual had become so ingrained in her daily movements that she found herself, even years later, counting to 30 under her breath before entering buildings, feeling phantom water around her feet, reciting phrases that had no meaning beyond their endless repetition. When Stapleton died, his journals and research notes were sealed by his executive, a Charleston lawyer named William Presley, who deemed them too disturbing for public consumption. 3 researchers who later gained access to the journals in the 1850 suffered what physicians documented as severe mental disturbances. Though historians now understand these were likely moral breakdowns from confronting the calculated cruelty documented in Stapleton's meticulous notes. The detailed observations of human suffering treated as data points in an experiment. The main house at Hartwell Landing burned in 1849 under circumstances never fully explained. Some said it was an accident, a kitchen fire that spread too quickly to contain. Others whispered that the servants, finally free after emancipation slow legal processes, chose to erase the place where the ritual had governed their lives for nearly 3 decades. The fire destroyed the ritual basin along with everything else, reducing the copper to a melted lump found in the ruins. But the document listing the 47 original rules survived, preserved in courthouse archives. That single-page officials tried 3 times to burn and could not destroy, either because of simple bureaucratic inefficiency or because of that irregular quality the records mentioned but never explained. It remains there still a testament to humanity's capacity for both elaborate cruelty and stubborn resistance. A reminder that even perfect compliance cannot erase the truth of what is being demanded. Some of Stapleton's former slaves left South Carolina after emancipation. Others remained building lives in the ruins of the world that had enslaved them. Dinina lived until 1862, dying at the age of 82, without ever seeing her daughter Ruth again. Marcus lived until 1871, working as a carpenter in Charleston and telling stories about his mother's courage to his own children. Thomas learned to read fluently after the war and spent his later years documenting oral histories of enslavement, including detailed accounts of the ritual at Hartwell Landing. Benjamin Lundy's newspaper articles about the Charleston demonstration became source material for later abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, who cited Stapleton's ritual in his speeches as an example of slavery's psychological cruelties. The story spread, transformed through retellings, becoming part of the larger narrative about what enslavement did to human consciousness and how that consciousness resisted even under conditions designed to destroy it. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The past holds secrets more disturbing than any fiction, and we'll continue uncovering them together. See you in the next video.